I know it's even better from that angle.
And we're live with Virtually Connecting at the Digital Pedagogy Lab Institute, I think it's formally called. And we have special guests from the conference itself on the ground and a bunch of virtual participants. And so I'm Nate Angel. I'm acting as the buddy here for Virtually Connecting. And I would like to kick the introductions over to the people on site so that they can introduce themselves and we know who we're talking with, and then we will go around and introduce the virtual participants. So would Verena like to start it out?
I'm Verena. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I'm here. And yesterday I presented for the first K-12 stream, as they call it, beta here, on open and critical pedagogy in K-12 learning environments, which you can imagine is an interesting topic. And I focused it from an Indigenous knowledge perspective. I'm currently a learning science candidate at University of Calgary, and I'm teaching some teachers in the fall.
Hi, I'm Marcus Elliott, and I work at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. This is my first digiped, and thankfully I'm not having to deliver anything. I just get to consume all that knowledge and meet some fantastic people.
Hi everyone, I'm Danica Savanek. I just finished my PhD in English at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'll be starting as an assistant professor of English at SUNY Cortland in the fall. This is also my first time at the Digital Pedagogy Lab Institute, but I do actually have to present something tomorrow, and that will be on the feminist art of writing about teaching, which is based on my research on the feminist and anti-racist pedagogies of some famous poets from the late 60s, such as Audre Lorde and June Jordan and a few others.
Great.
Hi, I'm Karen Angelosi. I'm one of the VC on-site buddies.
And I'm Jim Luke, aka Econ Prof, and I'm the on-site buddy too.
Great, it's so great to have you all here. And so there's a whole bunch of us virtually participating today, and I'd like to have us just say a short introduction so that the people there on the ground know who we are and where we come from. I'm Nate Angel. I work for Hypothesis, which is the nonprofit organization that stewards annotation technologies and practices. Ian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, Ian O'Byrne. I am currently employed at the College of Charleston. I study and write about literacy, technology, and education.
And Sue?
Sorry, I've lost the list there. No, who's next? I'm Sue Beckingham from Sheffield, Hallam, which is in the UK. And I teach in the Department of Computing, soft side of computing. So I teach digital marketing and entrepreneurial theory and practice, and interested in social media for learning and teaching as a research interest.
And Whitney?
I think I'm next. Hi, I'm Whitney Kilgore. I teach adjunct at the University of North Texas and started a little company here in the US called iDesign, working on building online learning experiences for universities. I also work with Sue behind the scenes as editor of the social media stream in the International Journal for Online Education.
Hi, I think I'm next. I'm Teresa McKinnon. I'm a Principal Teaching Fellow at the School of Languages at the University of Warwick in the Midlands. I've also worked with Sue and quite a few people around here. I'm a regional lead for the UK for Virtually Connecting, and really pleased to be connecting with more open pedagogues because I'm an open education practitioner and always keen to hear what people are thinking and how the discussions are evolving.
Great. I guess it's Sherry then next.
Okay, hi, this is Sherry Spelitz, and I am an elementary physical education specialist in Vienna, Austria. And I was at digiped last year in Vancouver, so excited to hear what's going on this year.
And last but not least, Liana.
Hello, my name is Leona Meaden, and I work at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And I'm also doing my PhD, and I'm looking at the online behaviors and activities of academics, their academic footprints. So it's quite nice to tune in with you guys.
That's great. And just maybe to kick things off, we didn't miss anybody, right?
Me, you missed me.
Oh, Ma, right. Gosh. Only the most important person.
No, I'm Maha Bailey. I am the co-founder of Virtually Connecting. I'm here in Cairo, Egypt with my little girl. And I organized a digital pedagogy lab in Cairo in 2016, I guess. And last year I was leading a track at the pedagogy lab in Fredericksburg. I'm really curious to hear how you guys are doing, how your first couple of days have been, and what are you doing? Like, I know some of you are doing workshops, so.
It's a little hard to hear, Mom.
Oh, difficult to hear?
Yeah, maybe.
Sorry.
There you go.
Hoda, yeah, Hoda had the mic.
Oh.
Hoda
has the mic.
Anyway, everybody knows me, so just tell me how your 2 days have been so far.
Yeah, let's hear from the folks on the ground about how the conference is going for them.
I want to hear some.
Sure. As I said before, this is my first time at Digital Pedagogy Lab, and it's been really great to have the opportunity to meet a lot of people that I've, only interacted with before on Twitter. I got, just on the way to lunch today, I got to have a conversation with somebody who read one of my blogs about a class constitution exercise that I use in my classes. And he was talking about how he kind of adapted that for his own classes and using kind of form that he sends out to all the students to solicit their input. And then he pulls that all together and they kind of collectively author a class constitution. And whereas I had done it, in the middle of most of my classes, he starts the very first day of class and they work for really the first 3 weeks of the semester on this exercise. So that's just one of the examples of the kinds of connections I've been able to make and really great conversations that I've been able to have at the conference so far. Anya's talk yesterday was also really wonderful. I keep thinking about the comparison that she made. Kind of her rhetorical move in that talk was to say that the best schools right now are the schools for robots and for artificial intelligence. And so she used that example to really raise the question of, how can we make our schools better? How can we invest in children? How can we get them the kind of really deep and engaged learning that is currently reserved for AI? So I thought that was a really brilliant kind of storytelling strategy with really interesting implications. And so I think that's available online for whoever was not able to attend and watch that. Yeah, so that was really great learning that. Oh, did we hear someone?
Well, this is my first international conference, so it's quite exciting in itself. Yesterday I was with Lee Scarlett-Bissett, who we were looking at digital fluency, which from a UK perspective, I was quite interested in how that compared to our, I guess it's kind of embedded the digital capabilities as the term we generally use. We've moved on from digital literacies, I think, a little bit. But actually having that kind of international perspective to how we consider the skills and the attitudes that people develop using digital tools and some of the behaviours. It was really, really interesting. So I had some fantastic conversations with a range of colleagues from different institutions, from community colleges and schools through to sort of big name universities and much larger universities. And then obviously the keynote yesterday was fantastic, really thought-provoking. I would suggest if you haven't watched it to watch it. There's a really moving story about a monkey. Very, very good. But yeah, again, it's that value of education, and do we, as a country, as a group of educators, as the world, do we actually value education in the same way that we value some other sort of exploits? So technology was one, was the kind of main one, the AI. But yeah, it's been really interesting.
I had the privilege of teaching and facilitating yesterday and it was exciting to really have a group. There were a wide range. There were some K-12 teachers who are teaching already today, so they're back in school today. So it was really, I was really honored, and I want to acknowledge their time for taking the time to spend it with us. And then there was a wide range of people in education, really from across the U.S. or teaching teachers. What also really made me feel very special and good was that we did bring, we used Indigenous knowledge in order to think about what place and space that we're learning in terms of education and learning, and how to support different voices and perspectives. And it's not always something to think about necessarily in many of our US schools, as I learned yesterday. In Canada, we have what's called reconciliation, and it is expected of all of us legally. And so it's a very tense situation. It's not a warm, fuzzy topic, I would say, at the moment in Canada as well. So it was a really interesting way of learning for myself on how I can better think about Indigenous knowledge from a Canadian perspective. And what was neat was scaffolding the ideas of that open learning happens in face-to-face learning environments and then can transition into digital environments. And that's what we did throughout the day. What we would normally do in 3 months, we did in 1 day. But it was really exciting to see that it worked and it progressed. And my favorite moment was when one of the teachers said, "Oh, we don't really need a learning management system. You haven't used one yet. And you seem to be doing some great things." And I actually used Hypothesis, and we used a wide variety of tools in the classroom without me actually saying anything about learning management systems. So that taught me there's different ways to approach how we talk about open learning. So I think that kind of summarizes it. And today I'm learning with Chris Gilliard and Bill Fitzgerald about data and privacy. And whoa, it's a different world. So it was quite a morning. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions or perspectives on what they learned?
I noticed that you're talking about, I mean, what you just said about the LMS is interesting. Would you say that the general atmosphere of the Institute is one that is beyond the LMS?
I would say no. I mean, I'm in the track on literacy, on digital literacies, and we started with a conversation around LMSs, and everyone was kind of sharing their grievances and their frustrations. But then Jade, who's the facilitator, really pushed that conversation by telling us why she likes learning management systems. And getting us to kind of think differently about how her big thing is with user agreements, and saying that if you're in an institutional space that has already purchased Blackboard or Moodle or Canvas, whatever it is, using that platform to communicate with your students, with faculty, is the only thing that you can safely use without having to scrutinize the user agreement and the statement and the privacy to see like what is happening. So I thought that was just like an interesting perspective, that because I do very much come from a place like I'm super anti-Blackboard. I love using WordPress. So I am part of that like anti-LMS ethos. So to hear it then from her perspective, kind of like pushing back against that a little bit was really interesting.
I can say something about that too. I think like any tool, the LMS is something that can be used in a good way or in a bad way. And I also kind of creatively use a hybrid between my own open domain spaces and my students having open web domain spaces, but use the LMS for things that do need to remain private. And so you can have that private public kind of combination that's going on there. And I think, it's probably Robin DeRosa that's said, open is not the opposite of private, right? And so I think using the LMS in a strategic way, but not allowing it to contain everything, helps to kind of get at that.
And also using it critically, like being aware of its limitations and why it's problematic, but then that might still inform your decision to use it in certain instances.
Well, when we were talking about Hypothesis and we were using it, what was interesting was many of them had it in their learning management systems, but they didn't know that it was there. So when I used it as a different tool, and it did come across as a tool yesterday, that's when it became learning in the open, as opposed to when it was being used in a learning management system. And then we were able to talk about how you can scaffold it, how you can make it private spaces or open spaces. But then the data came up as well, because we had students that aren't 13, so technically they couldn't use it, or could they use it? So then we talked about using Google. Like, so it created a conversation of how we can promote like open educational learning opportunities, scaffolding them for a variety of different students based on what they can do due to a wide variety of reasons, not just being in K-12, but they might not want people to know information. So yeah, it brought about a whole conversation.
We had a very interesting conversation about power of LMS's VLEs and their kind of intended purpose, and around the idea that the LMS is a administrative tool to basically organize people into groups. And from that point of view, it's fantastic. It does a great job of putting people in the right modules or courses or classes or whatever. But then what's happened is lots and lots of extra features and functions have been added on. And they're some of the things that people get frustrated with. So it's looking beyond that, that kind of its core functionality of getting people into the right administrative groups, and actually, does it do the secondary job well in a way that we didn't get an answer, but it was an interesting conversation.
I just noticed what you said there, Ian, that hypothesis is a Trojan horse for open pedagogy, but that's the same thing that we realized in K-12 for open educational resources. K-12 teachers don't use the words open educational resources, and they don't think in general of Creative Commons. So it's really, really important to think about open practice as opposed to just open product or open content. And I think that those were the conversations that we had a lot today. And that in a learning management system, again, you're not going to know what's in it unless you play with it in different ways and separate it and pull it apart, like digital artifacts, which was actually where open educational resources actually originated from, the idea of just digital artifacts and how do we collect them and pull them together and think about copyright in different ways.
Interesting. Can you explain what you meant by hypothesis being a Trojan horse for open education?
Ian?
Are we going to a different question, or you want me to jump in here? What do you want me to do, Nate?
I mean, it's part of the flow. Teresa had a question. Teresa, was your question going to take us in another direction?
Not particularly, actually. I think what was just said leads very nicely into it, because this discussion. Thanks. Sorry, Ian. I'll try and be quick, but it's really the critical digital insights that I'm thinking through at the moment for some training courses that we're doing for Erasmus+. And amongst the reading was something from John Dewey, and he's one of my go-to people, really. Unless the mass of workers are to be blind cogs and pinions in the apparatus they employ, they must have some understanding of the physical and social facts behind and ahead of the material and appliances, tools, with which they're dealing. And I'm really heartened by the fact that we're having a conversation around making these things explicit and encouraging people not to abdicate their personal understanding when they're using digital tools and leave it to the IT specialists, because that is very dangerous. So this assumption that your IT department will take care of security, and in some ways the GDPR discussions and the privacy discussions are kind of pushing us in this route. You don't have to worry about a thing, just use the tools we provide. I think it's really important that we as practitioners say, actually, yeah, you do need to know what you're doing, not necessarily for your course completion, but you need to know what you're doing for life. Yeah, if we're involved in lifelong learning, we need to make sure that people are aware of what agency they have and how to critically evaluate their choice of tools. So I'm really heartened by the fact that we're having those discussions, and I think it's really important, whatever sort of part of the piece of the puzzle we are, whatever our role as learning technologists or as practitioners, as teachers, we contribute to opening up those conversations.
On that note, I was just thinking the way we got to that in our conversation was because our focus was on building relationships with our students. And when you know your students, it's much more important to think about how their voice and their choice and their age and whatever else we need to consider in terms of ethnic, large questions of diversity. But that can only happen if you have a relationship with them and you know who you're learning with.
Yeah, and what Teresa just said also made me think about how I approach this all from a faculty perspective. And this question of LMS has been on my mind frequently because I'm moving to a new institution and I'm doing so much additional work to figure out how I can not use Blackboard, but how I can stick to my belief in using WordPress to build course sites and to teach students and take them into the back end and show them how knowledge is organized on a website. And I think, part of what needs to happen in this greater shift is to raise awareness among faculty, but also shift reward structures so that this kind of labor of creating safe and open and engaging learning environments for our students is valued, because right now, this is all time that I should be spending on research. It's not going to be rewarded in any way. And I'm constantly back and forth with the IT department trying to work with them. And so, we just need to always be shifting the reward and evaluation structures to create the spaces to have the kind of critical, engaged pedagogy that we want.
That's so important to voice that, because there's a real danger, especially in higher education institutions, that people think, okay, we don't need to know anything about technology within my department. That's just the job of somebody else. And blindly follow that. And the power that's involved, the sort of power systems and structures, mean it's actually very easy for practitioners and for students to lose their voice in those discussions. Sorry, Ian, I've impinged on your time. Jump in.
We were thinking that Whitney actually had something that was going to take us in a slightly different direction, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I'm drawn back to Verena's comment about OER earlier. So I think when I think of open educational practices or pedagogical practices, it is this collegial sharing, it is virtually connecting, it is doing things differently and thinking beyond the LMS. But when you talked about teachers not even understanding what open educational resources are, I'm concerned that that conversation is also kind of the Trojan horse, right? So if we can start sharing our resources, then maybe we think differently about teaching and learning. And so, Verena, do you use Teachers Pay Teachers as an example of how not to do it? There's got to be a better way to be more open and move them towards Creative Commons. And how does that discussion help them change their mental models and think differently?
And also, what is Teachers Pay Teachers?
Oh, sorry. So Teachers Pay Teachers is a giant conglomerate of opportunities for teachers to sell their lesson plans or activities. Yeah. So I was very anti-Teachers Pay Teachers for a long time until I listened to Howard Rheingold, and he actually did an interview with a teacher. And as a Canadian, I didn't understand how badly paid teachers are. So thank you for bringing that up, Whitney. Teachers do not make a lot of money in the US. And so quite honestly, for the work that they do, I really have to value any opportunity they have to make any kind of money outside, especially if it's going to support teaching and learning, whether I agree with that pedagogical approach or not. However, that did come up yesterday, and we did talk about it from that point of view. The hardest thing to do, I just came from being a district coordinator at a K-12 institution, or at a K-12 district, and I was in charge of all the resources in the whole district, so licensing and open educational resources, and we were one of the only districts to support open educational resources, and yet we still didn't have teachers sharing, and so I think that talking about mindset for teachers and sharing, and a lot of that has to do with they've never learned how to necessarily be a student in an inquiry-based environment or in an experiential type learning environment or a pedagogical approach that they're asked to teach, but they've never been the learner in themselves. So it goes back to theory and Dewey, you bring back Dewey again here. Dewey talked about the fact that you can't just have learning in one institutional environment. You have to have it outside. So in informal learning environments and formal learning environments, when we talked about inside and outside spaces in order to learn. And he also talked about like the idea of democracy to learn and to have voice and choice in your own learning. So I think I would take back any comments I've ever made in Twitter or anywhere else about teachers pay teachers, but I might not have done them. On the other hand, to know what Creative Commons is, again, they don't know. That has been the biggest insight for K-12 educators, because they're like, I can share something and it can be attributed. That we definitely need to focus on, I would say, is the Creative Commons aspect. The open educational resource phenomena in the US is also very focused on textbooks. And so that's not why I promote it either, because I'm more promoted on the practice side, how we can use textbooks, make textbooks apart. So I might not be the best person to answer that question, Whitney, from a K-12 perspective, but I just want to say kind of I support it all. I don't think, like you said, with the LMSs and like Robin said, there's no one way to do anything. The way to do it is to look at multiple perspectives.
We have about a minute.
Oh, sorry.
We have to get to the workshops.
Very, very quickly. I used to work in a secondary school, high school, and actually there in the UK there is a culture of sharing your stuff, resources, but you don't necessarily design it. Use it.
It's designing for sharing.
Exactly.
Absolutely, the idea of designing for sharing.
And the issue is this now being kind of monetized in a way. So people like the Times Educational Supplement have a whole load of resources that they then choose not, sell on a little bit, which is a big issue. Just teachers don't know about Creative Commons, but they know about sharing and about that kind of collegiality. Maybe it's just connecting the dots between the two.
Well, we know that you folks on the ground have a lot of other stuff that you have to get to do, so we don't want to take up too much of your time.
We'll ask Ian to answer your question, Verena, and then you can watch the answer later. You guys have a good time. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Can we stay online for a few more minutes? I actually have to go, but if Ian wants to answer that question and other folks want to stay online.
Yeah, so we can.
And then, but you guys on site can go because you have sessions to go to.
Yeah, feel free to go away if you need to.
Yeah, you could do that.
I don't.
Bye, guys. Okay, I'm leaving. Bye.
So just to let you know, the broadcast is still going, and so we could stop it and chat informally, even more informally than this, or we could continue to record if we feel like we're having a worthy discussion here.
At least record Ian's response to Verena, though.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go. Bye.
You want to talk, Ian?
Yeah, I think that I brought up the piece about the Trojan horse for open. I think that it's important for us to remember where the students that we work with, if they're in pre-service programs, or our colleagues, or people that we write with and research with. It's important to be mindful of where they are. Find their approach point. And so, in my classes and in my work, I try to nudge my colleagues and nudge my students to open and to using these new tools. And I'm currently a mentor in our university's distance ed program, which all it is a gateway before you can teach online. It's basically you take this class and prove that you can teach online. So it's always interesting to think about different ways to find that approach point and be like a Trojan horse, as I said, to get people into stuff. So I didn't think about the use of hypothesis as that Trojan horse for open pedagogy. I had a note in there, the talk about teachers pay teachers, that has proved to be a quote unquote Trojan horse for me to talk about Creative Commons licensing. When I talk about CC licensing in classes, students often don't care. They don't see the reason to license their content. They don't feel like their content is valuable enough to license. And then once I mention that they are sharing lesson plans and unit plans on the websites I have them build, and that other teachers are selling those, then all of a sudden they're like very capitalistic. Then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I could sell this for money. I don't want someone to take my content and sell it for money. So then they really, really care about CC licensing. But I use hypothesis a lot, not enough in my own work, but then I use it a lot in my classes. And I do it from a literacy perspective because I'm trying to think differently and how my students think differently about reading and literacy practices. But I'm going to do a lot of thinking in the future about how it might be a tool to be that gateway into, or open up your horizons to, okay, here's our LMS, we're in, you know, Blackboard or Desire to Learn or whatever, but then we're going to use Hypothesis as a tool, as a gateway for us to get out of this. And once you get out, then you can say, okay, see this different air that we're in right now, this different sandbox, this is the beginnings, or this is what open looks like.
Yana, did you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah, sure. Just Hey, Ian. I was quite interested in your gateway to go and teach online course. Is it open?
It's not. It's I basically what my institution does is they put together I think it's like 8 weeks. There's a lot of content. There's a lot of curriculum. It's basically take your syllabus, you know, make it more visual. What is a screencast and a screen capture? How do you integrate that into the course? It talks a lot about chunking and not a lot of instructional design, but chunking of content to get it ready. It's sort of like the best use of the time for me is it's a time management lesson for faculty that are busy all the time. So it's time management, and it's also having it basically forces faculty to design in the learning management system that we have. So I feel personally like it's a hoop to get faculty to jump through in order to teach online. A lot of the stuff that's in it, we already know, and a lot of the stuff that's in it, you know, I have on my blog, and most of us already have a lot of that. It's, you know, instructional design, it's chunking of content, it's screencast and screen capture, it's different forms, different digital tools that are out there to support learners, you know, affordances of those tools and affordances of those spaces. A lot of stuff that we usually do, but it's basically written as sort of a leaping off point for, you know, a lot of colleagues that don't do this sort of stuff, aren't sitting here on a webinar at virtually connecting and stuff. But I can, if you shoot me a note, I can behind the scenes send you a lot of the stuff that's in there.
So there are others too on that are open and with open practices that are already on a list. Oh, there's another child.
Nate, as someone that's gainfully employed by Hypothesis, what was your takeaway from the talk about Hypothesis and it being a gateway for other stuff?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I never expect conversations like this to turn to Hypothesis as much as that one did, just because I don't think it was because I was here, but I'm always like, oh, I'm here and everybody's talking about Hypothesis. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, usually it's not that way. Usually you, like, even when I'm sitting and talking with like a lot of tech people, it's like when I'm talking to the ed tech people in my department, I'll talk about like badges or blockchain and they're like, what is this? And if I talk about Hypothesis, they're like, what in the world is this, like, you know, witchcraft? So what did you think about all that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I definitely think about and like the idea of, you know, using annotation practices as a kind of gateway drug or Trojan horse, however you want to describe it, to other kinds of practices and pedagogies that are more open or outside the LMS or whatever. So I thought that was really interesting and worthy. There's the technical barriers between dancing inside the LMS and dancing outside the LMS are substantial, especially if everybody wants single sign-on. And so this is something that Hypothesis is kind of struggling technically with quite a bit now, is how to make it super easy for people to use Hypothesis in an LMS environment so that everybody can have single sign-on and really kind of get into annotation really easily, but at the same time also still enable the possibility of taking that outside the LMS and going further with it. So it is a little bit of it's not an easy problem to solve. There's witchcraft involved.
Well, I think it's one of those things that people said at the beginning, that the nice thing about the LMS is that it's sort of this walled garden and you can be locked down and you can trust everything that's there. Like a lot of my colleagues in this Get Distance Ed course, they're all learning how to use VoiceThread. And I'm like, okay, well, I liked VoiceThread a decade ago, but I don't really value it anymore. But everyone loves VoiceThread and Prezi. And I think part of it is because you can sign on and use your institutional credentials and everything is safe. And if you have your kids use Coggle or another tool and sign on using their Google Apps account, sort of you can trust it. And if your kids get in trouble, you can say, hey, I didn't know it was the institutional connection. Whereas one of the challenges with open pedagogy and these digital texts and tools and something like Hypothesis, I'm specifically drawing a trail right out of the LMS. And I'm taking you across the internet. And yes, I'm dealing with, for the most part, adults, at least in age. I'm taking you on a tour of the internet. And so all the good and the bad that's out there, you're going to see. And so, I have to be prepared for that. I have to have a good answer for it. I have to protect my students when they get out there. Some of my colleagues are like, well, you would bring somebody out and they could just see all the bad stuff that's out there. I'm like, yeah, this is life. But then I'd also be interested if are there use cases or are there times where, for lack of a better question, like bad things have happened in open pedagogy or something like Hypothesis specifically. You don't have to answer either one of those, but are there times when a teacher has brought a class of kids out there and it's like, oh, this is what occurred and how we sort of dealt with that. So it'd be interesting to be aware of that and start developing case studies so we can inform each other as we take these risks and challenges. How do we protect ourselves?
Yeah, well, no specific incident comes to mind. Jeremy Dean might have some other ones that he's come across because he's more deeply involved in the education space than I am, despite my history with it. But at any rate, I like what you're saying in the sense that, rather than seeing the idea of leading out into a tour of the full internet as a sort of, scary problem, it's instead an opportunity to bring digital literacies into the conversation and incorporate that as part of your pedagogy. Now, of course, depending on what your subject matter is, that may be like a whole extra burden of, of thinking and learning that has to go on top of maybe you're studying, something that has nothing to do with digital literacy. So.
Yeah, I agree.
Hey, you know what? I think I'm going to stop the broadcast here.
Yeah, sounds good.
And we can continue to chat, but you can also take